Okay, so I'll start. Okay, so just in case anybody hasn't got the handout, I have attached a handout to the chat. You should be able to download it from there. Let me know if there's any problem with that. So a little bit of background to this talk. So I'm currently working on a book on conscious experience. And I had the idea, because I think it's going to take me some time to finish the book, I had the idea of trying to publish a sort of bare bones version of the theory that I'm developing. And so I wrote a paper on it, which is the one that was circulated in advance and which I'm going to be talking about. But I'm having a lot of trouble getting it published. So I'm a little bit bemused by this. It's been rejected by a number of journals, usually without even giving me any comments. So there may be something deeply wrong with the ideas that I'm about to present to you. I mean, the obvious explanations for my having difficulty getting this published are either that this is something that really does need a whole book in order to explain it clearly, and I think that is a possibility, or I'm just not noticing some horrible error that I'm making, in which case I really hope you'll tell me what it is, to save me spending the next several years writing a book with a horrible error in the middle of it. Or else these are just unfamiliar ideas that take time to digest, and the journal referees didn't have time to digest them. So I don't know. Maybe I've just had bad luck. Anyway, this is what I'm going to present to you, and hoping that I don't expose a horrible error, but if it's there, I'd rather know. Now, for regulars at this seminar, you will have heard me talking about some of this stuff before. The last time was about 18 months ago. And on that occasion, I really had to rush through the second half of the material. There's two basic ideas behind this. And so I talked at some length about one of them, but there was very little time to talk about the other one. Since then, I've rewritten the paper, and actually I've reversed the order of exposition. So I'm actually going to start into the stuff that I didn't say very much about last time. I may or may not have time to then go on to go over the other stuff again. We'll see. But I most wanted to talk about the stuff that I didn't have much time to talk about last time. It'll be new to quite a few of you anyway. What this is all about is, well, it's a theory of conscious experience that provides a way of defending a relatively traditional kind of materialist theory. I say relatively traditional because there is a recent trend in, well, inspired by work in philosophy of perception, to adopt what seems to me to be a quite radical view called phenomenal externalism, according to which the phenomenal character of a conscious experience, that is the what it's like to have the conscious experience, does not supervene on the internal configuration of the experiencing subject, but just supervenes on the internal configuration of the subject plus features of the subject's environment. So, same sort of view as semantic externalism, but applied to phenomenal character. And that would mean that two people could be in exactly the same brain configuration, and yet their phenomenology could be quite different. Those views are quite popular. They're popular with naive realists, and they're popular with many strong intentionalists. But it is quite a radical departure from a traditional notion of conscious experience, according to which the phenomenal character of your conscious experience really just depends on what's going on in your brain or things that your brain is directly connected to. So my theory preserves phenomenal internalism, and it also provides a very nice story about why there is an epistemological gap between knowledge of the physical world and knowledge of the phenomenal character of mental states. And it is that epistemological gap that lies behind a lot of the most important arguments against materialist theories of consciousness, like the knowledge argument and the conceivability argument. The conceivability argument is the one about zombies, all the David Chalmers stuff. So the part of the theory that I'm going to talk about first, and perhaps spend the most time on, is the part that addresses that epistemic gap. But I have to explain some features of the theory before I can explain to you how this works. Okay. So one feature of work on consciousness in recent years is that there's been a move away from just thinking about conscious experiences as being, well, if you're a materialist, certain kinds of physical states that have certain causal powers, and instead thinking of conscious states in terms of perception and quite often in terms of representational content. The thought is conscious experiences have representational contents, and perhaps by thinking about those representational contents and how they relate to the phenomenal character of the experience, perhaps we can learn something about phenomenal character. And one theory that very much does this is called intentionalism. And I've defined the stronger kind of intentionalism on the handout. Informally, what this theory says is that, first of all, that experiences have representational contents. That's got to apply to all conscious experiences if it's going to be a theory of all conscious experiences. And what it means to say that a conscious experience has a representational content is really just to say that it has correctness conditions. So this is very easy for perceptual states. Suppose you're looking at my handout right now and you're looking at the words strong intentionalism towards the top there. Well, then your experience is correct or accurate if and only if there really is a white background with black letters saying strong intentionalism on it. And that way that things have to be for your experience to be accurate, you can think of that as being the representational content of the experience. So it's the way the world is according to the experience. Less obvious with experiences like pains, for example, but the usual story would be that a pain represents some sort of damage going on in some part of your body. And that may or may not be happening, but the pain can still represent it as being such, whether or not it's really happening. So experiences have representational contents, and the strongest version of intentionalism says that, in fact, the phenomenal character of the experience can be reduced to its representational content. So, as I put on the handout there, the notion of an experience with phenomenal character P can be considered as identical to an experience with representational content C. So everything we can say about an experience that has a certain phenomenal character, we could just interchange with talking about an experience that has a certain representational content. There is, according to this view, nothing more to the phenomenal character of an experience than the experience presenting the world as being a certain way. In particular, this kind of theory denies that there are what are sometimes called intrinsic qualia. And intrinsic qualia are supposed to be qualitative properties of your experience of a kind that you might be able to attend to in introspection. So you're looking at a red object, and if you believe in intrinsic qualia, then you believe that there is a sort of intrinsic mental redness quality of your experience to which you can attend. Strong intentionalists, myself included, deny that there are any such intrinsic qualia. What we think is that when you try to attend to that supposed mental property of the phenomenological redness that you experience when you look at the tomato, all you're actually attending to is the tomato and the redness of the tomato itself. And that's a very common view in philosophy of perception these days. It's not only strong intentionalists that think this, also naive realists about perception, despite some big differences between them and intentionalists. They will agree that there are no intrinsic qualia and that all you can attend to when you try to introspect your experience is the perceived properties of the world. And if you're subject to some sort of illusion, the world may or may not have those properties, but you can attend to the property even if in fact it's not instantiated. So we sometimes talk about phenomenal contents as being equivalent to the notion of that component of the representational content of an experience to which the phenomenal character is reducible. So this thing I've labeled C on the handout, where an experience with phenomenal character P is identical to an experience with representational content C. That thing C is the phenomenal content. So this sort of view has been argued for some time now by people like Michael Tye and Fred Dretske. Now, one feature of this kind of intentionalism, and it also is shared by naive realists actually, is that it's usually thought to be the properties of perceived objects, the represented properties of perceived objects that fix the phenomenal character. It's not the identity of specific individuals, because if you look at one of a pair of identical twins and then you look at the other one, the other of the pair of perfectly identical twins, the phenomenal character of your experience will be exactly the same in both cases. That's just really what we mean by calling them identical twins. If they're perfect duplicates, they look exactly the same. So although there'll be a different specific individual represented in your experience, it won't make any difference to the phenomenology. But the usual view is the represented colors and size and shape and other properties like that, that's what determines the phenomenal character. So when you look at a ripe tomato, it's the redness, that red property of the tomato being represented that gives it the phenomenological redness, and it's the size of the tomato that determines the phenomenological size of it, and so on. Now, the theory that I want to defend is a version of strong intentionalism, but it differs from this standard assumption that it's represented properties that determine phenomenal character. Instead, it's represented relations between the perceiving subject and the subject's environment. So let me say just a little bit about that. It's a very common observation that experience is in certain respects perspectival. We view the world from a certain point of view. And this is particularly obvious with the spatial aspects of experience. When you, and particularly with vision, when you look at the world around you, you see it from a particular point in space, and things look near or far to a certain extent, and they look to the left or to the right or up and down. And of course, these things are all relative to the perceiving subject. So in certain respects, it seems quite uncontroversial that at least some aspects of experience are perspectival. Now, a perspective is a set of relations. If you think about spatial perspective, to view the world from a certain spatial perspective is just to view it given that one stands in certain relations to it. It's nearby, it's to one's left, and so on. So a set of relations between the person whose perspective it is and the thing that that person has that perspective on. Now, my view says that experience is radically perspectival. It's not just spatial or temporal perspective, but pretty much everything phenomenological involves perspective, involves relations between the experiencing subject and whatever it is that's being perceived. There are some exceptions to that. When you look at 3 objects, that looks different from if there were 4 objects, and there doesn't seem to be anything perspectival about the number of objects that's represented. But what I do want to say is that in every case where the standard strong intentionalist would say that phenomenal character exists because a certain property is represented as being instantiated, What I want to do is replace that talk of a property being represented with talk of a relation between the subject and the object being represented. And I call these relations subject-environment relations. Now, last time I gave a version of this material in this seminar, I then proceeded to spend a very large part of the time explaining and motivating this view that phenomenal contents are made up of subject-environment relations. What I want to do this time is set aside the motivations for that theory. Perhaps I'll say just a little bit more as I go along about what kinds of subject-environment relations I have in mind. But I want to mostly set aside the details and the motivation and talk about one of the consequences. So at this point, let's just assume for the sake of argument that my hypothesis is right, that the phenomenal character of any conscious experience is reducible to a representation of a subject-environment relation. And now I want to talk about what would follow if that were true. And then if there's time, I want to come back and talk about why I think there's an independent reason for thinking it is true. But the fact that this hypothesis provides such a nice way of explaining why there's an epistemic gap between knowledge of the physical and knowledge of the phenomenological, I think is already a significant point in its favor. Okay, so moving on now to the proper part one of the talk. So this is probably all extremely familiar stuff, and I'm not going to go over it in any detail, but as is well known, arguments like the knowledge argument and the conceivability argument seek to undermine materialism by trading on the fact that there is an epistemic gap between knowledge of the physical and knowledge of the mental. So in the knowledge argument, Mary, the physically omniscient color scientist, knows all the physical facts, but learns something new when she comes to see something red for the first time. So it appears that somehow there is a gap between knowledge of physical states and knowledge of phenomenological states. Similarly, the conceivability argument is all about the assumption that zombies are conceivable, and then goes on to argue that they are possible. Zombies being perfect physical duplicates of you, but without any phenomenology at all. And well, when David Chalmers talks about the conceivability argument, it's worth noticing that he defines conceivability rather carefully, and he can get his argument working with what he calls negative conceivability, which is to say that zombies are negatively conceivable is to just say that one cannot rule out through a priori reasoning that somebody who has a certain physical specification might not have any phenomenology. That is to say, no matter how much you know about the physical characteristics of a person, one cannot, by purely a priori reasoning, get from there to knowledge about the phenomenal character of their conscious states. And Chalmers goes on from that to argue that since zombies are conceivable in that sense, they are possible, and that undermines materialism. Personally, I have looked at Chalmers' argument many, many times. I don't think there's any straightforward flaw in his reasoning. So, in order to defend a materialist theory, then, we need a story about why there is this epistemic gap. That's what I'm going to give you. The key to all this, in my view, is a thing called first-person redundancy. And if you've heard me give a talk about practically anything in the last 5 years or so, you've probably heard me banging on about first-person redundancy. And I plan to continue banging on about it until or unless somebody shows me that there's a problem with it, because I think that it's really, really important and solves a whole bunch of philosophical problems. The notion of first-person redundancy gives us a way of understanding the notion of the first-person perspective. I think it's the key to all the stuff about essential indexicals, I think it may also be a key to understanding why certain kinds of mental states are needed for practical action. But I also think it's the key to understanding the epistemological gap between physical knowledge and phenomenological knowledge. So, first-person redundancy. So consider a normal judgment that you might make in which you apply some n-place predicate. So you judge using the two-place predicate is taller than. You judge that person A is taller than person B. Ordinarily, to make that judgment, you would need two pieces of information. You'd need the height of A and you'd need the height of B. So call those pieces of information parameters. So it's generally a fact that in order to apply an n-place predicate, you need n pieces of information. If you want to apply the one-place predicate is red, you just need to look at the color of the thing and you've got one bit of information there, one parameter, you can judge that that thing is red. If you want to judge that the height of B is in between the height of A and the height of C, so a three-place predicate, you need three pieces of information, the heights of A, B, and C. So that seems to be a general truth. There are some special cases, but when you think it through, it always involves you contributing information, making assumptions. But in ordinary cases of judgments based on perception of the world, this seems to hold true. However, there are some special cases where you can judge that a two-place predicate applies using only one parameter. And that's a certain set of cases involving relations between yourself and something else. So if you look at your computer screen right now, it's a certain distance away from you. It's near to a certain degree. Now, if I were in the room with you and I wanted to judge that you were at that distance from your computer screen, I would need two pieces of information. I would need to know your location and I'd need to know the location of the computer screen. But you are able to judge that the computer screen is about that far away using just one bit of information. The computer screen looks a certain way to you. It looks distant to a certain extent. In particular, you don't have to make the judgment that the computer screen is that far away by comparing your own position with that of the computer screen. You don't even have to be able to see yourself in order to make that judgment. You could be completely invisible or anyway peripheral vision just masked in such a way that you can't see yourself at all, and yet you're able to judge just on the basis of one parameter how far away that thing is. And therefore you're able to judge that a two-place relation exists between you and the computer screen based on just one bit of information. A very simple way to see how this could work is to imagine doing it using sonar. You send out pulses of sound and you time how long they take to get back. So all you need is that one number representing the time that it took for the sonar pulse to get back, and you can judge how far something is away from you. When you do this, you are trading on the fact that you are one of the relata in that two-place relation, and therefore taking an advantage of an epistemic perspective that you have on the holding of that relation, a perspective that no one else can have because they are not one of the relata in that relation. So there are lots of other examples of this thing that I'm calling first-person redundancy. And by the way, I call it first-person redundancy just because of the fact that any experiential representation of yourself would be redundant in the epistemic grounds for the judgment. That is to say, when you're judging how far away your computer screen is from you, you may, as a matter of fact, be able to see yourself. So you may have an experiential representation of yourself, but it doesn't play any role in your judgment that the screen is nearby to a certain extent. The same would apply if you were judging that the screen was to the left rather than to the right. You don't need that representation of yourself to make the judgment, so it would be redundant, and hence the phrase first-person redundancy. Another example, you can judge that something is heavy or heavy for you. So something that is heavy for me might not be heavy for you. If you're stronger than I am, then for you it may be quite easy to lift. So there's a sense in which something can be said to be heavy for me, but not heavy for you. If you want to judge whether or not a certain thing is heavy for me, you need two pieces of information. You need to know something about the weight of that object, and you need to know something about how strong I am. But when I judge whether or not something is heavy for me, I can just lift it up and I can just feel how heavy it is for me. There's just one bit of phenomenology I need to attend to there that's telling me how heavy that thing is for me. And so I'm able to judge that that thing is heavy for me or not heavy for me, just on the basis of one parameter. So again, I don't need to pay attention to the facts about myself, such as how strong I am. I can just attend to this one bit of information and come to the conclusion that I stand in that relation to the thing. Robert, yes.
So can I just, sorry, this is the first time I'm coming across this. So I was just wondering, back in the, so just returning to the sonar example, is it, maybe this is just an example with the sonar case, is it not the case that like when you send out the sound, yes, the information that you get back is like how long it takes for the sound to go from you to it and then back again. But then is there not also another piece of information there that is, you know when you sent the sound? So then is that not the two pieces of information? So you know when you sent it like time 0, and then you know when it comes back to you, and that's how you know. And I'm just trying to work out if that same principle can be applied to like judging how far away an object is from yourself.
Right. Let me think about that for a moment. So it's not necessarily that you need two pieces of information, because you can imagine doing it with a stopwatch. You have a button on the stopwatch. Let's suppose that pressing that button sends out the sound pulse. And then when the sound pulse comes back, you just look at the clock. So all you need is to read off what's on the stopwatch. You don't also need to know the time at which you pressed it. So I think...
Is it not the case that you sort of, that by, in order to start the time, there had to have been a time at which the timer was started. Sorry, that was really badly phrased.
It has to have been a time, but you don't necessarily have to know anything about it.
Well, but the stopwatch does so, right? Like the stopwatch has to know when it was started. And is it not that information that's being compared?
Yeah, I mean, look, as a matter of metaphysics, whenever you make one of these sorts of judgments, somehow or other your brain must be sensitive to facts about your relation to your environment. In a certain sense, I mean, in your vision, you're assuming, your brain is sort of assuming that you're seeing the world from a certain place, as it were. But epistemically, it's not that to make the judgment, you have to make the comparison involving the two things. Epistemologically, by being the person, and perhaps if a bat is using sonar, but I'd have to think this through a little more than I have, but somehow by being the bat that emitted the sonar, you get this kind of shortcut epistemologically. I think, yeah, I'll have to think about the sonar example. Maybe there's a complication there that's unnecessary. But I'm just thinking of ordinary perceptual judgments anyway. When something looks near or far, the very fact that you don't need to be able to see yourself seems to be sufficient to tell us that you don't have to make the judgment in the way that somebody else would have to make the judgment, by seeing where you are and comparing that with where the other thing is. So whether or not the sonar example is a good one, I will have to think about that. I think the phenomenon itself is okay.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm actually still not sure, but as I say, I have nothing else to say. So.
I mean, if there are other problems with this notion that people have, I'm very interested to hear about them, because this is at the core of a lot of things I'm doing. It seems right to me, but I'll grant that there are some details that I haven't fully spelled out about exactly what it takes for this to happen. In the case of spatial judgments, where you just look at things and they appear to you to be near or far or left or right or up and down, you're obviously trading on the fact that you occupy a certain location in space and your body is oriented in a certain way in space. You know, you're facing a certain direction, your head is up and your feet are down. And so you're making use of all those facts. But there's a difference between trading on those facts and actually having to attend to those facts in order to make the judgment in the way that somebody else would have to. Okay, I'll carry on. So I think that this gives us a helpful way to think about what we might mean when we talk about the first person perspective. If you consider that state of affairs, a certain person stands in some relation to an object. So I'm writing that on the handout as relation R holds between S and X, where S is the person and X is some object. So when you think about that state of affairs, if in order to judge that that state of affairs obtains, you would have to pay attention to both S and X and judge that they stand in that relation, so two pieces of information, then you are making that judgment from the third person perspective. That's something that anybody can do, whether or not they happen to be identical with S. Even S can make that judgment. If you happen to see yourself in the mirror, you can judge that you stand in a certain spatial relation to some object, but you do it in the same way that anybody else would then. But you can also encounter that state of affairs, that S stands in relation R to X, from the first person perspective, but only if you are S and if you have the right kind of access, like a certain kind of perceptual access to that state of affairs. So it won't be completely obvious yet how this goes, but I want to suggest that probably the only really useful notion of the first person perspective that's going to be relevant to things like our access to our conscious experiences and that kind of thing is going to be this notion of first person redundancy. That's the epistemologically interesting notion. And it's very different from what people have sometimes thought about when they've thought about having the first person perspective on your conscious experiences. People maybe don't say it quite like this because it sounds very mysterious when you do, but I feel that a lot of people, when they think about having the first person perspective on their conscious experiences, they're imagining that they are looking in through a kind of private window on an inner world. When you read things like Nagel's What Is It Like to Be a Bat, it seems as though he has this idea that you can encounter your experiences from the third person perspective, where you would maybe just discover a certain brain being in a certain configuration. But then you have this first person access to the experience that you can only have by having the experience and sort of introspecting it. I don't think that that notion of looking in on an inner world through a kind of private window is a very useful one at all. I think it's a very misleading notion of the first person perspective, and it importantly doesn't explain things. But I think that the notion of first person perspective that I'm suggesting does, and I shall explain how. So on the handout, I've put proposal 2. I think I forgot to actually say what proposal 1 was. Proposal 1 was just the claim that phenomenal contents consist of relations between the perceived environment and the experiencing subject, or subject-environment relations. Proposal 2 is the claim that not only do conscious experiences phenomenologically represent subject-environment relations, but that they do so in a way that grounds first-person redundant judgments. So the way I put it on the handout is, for every phenomenal character P and corresponding phenomenal content C, a conscious experience with P provides the epistemic ground for a first-person redundant judgment that C is the case. So I'm suggesting that not only does the phenomenon that I've just described apply to the phenomenology of seeing that an object is near to you to a certain extent and that a certain object feels heavy, but that this is completely general. In all cases, the phenomenology represents a relation, and the experience would put you in a position to judge that that relation obtained, to make the judgment first person redundantly. Now, you may well not always be aware even that it is a relation, let alone what exactly the relation is. So I'm not claiming that it is at all apparent to you that your phenomenology represents relations or that you could judge that that relation obtains. But I am claiming that conscious experiences provide those epistemic grounds. I've put in brackets there on the handout a qualification related to the one I made earlier, that this doesn't apply to literally every phenomenal character because, well, it might depend on exactly how you individuate phenomenal characters. You might think that all else being equal, 3 objects look different from 4 objects. And so you might then try to sort of extract from that an element of phenomenal character relating to the number of objects. If so, I'm not suggesting that there's anything represented by that other than just the number of objects. The crucial thing actually here is going to be that, that there are certain elements of phenomenology that we can imagine being inverted or being twin-earthed, and there are some that we can't imagine that with. And numbers of objects don't seem to be possible cases for phenomenological inversion or for twin-earth cases. Anybody who's having the phenomenology as of 3 objects is having an experience that represents 3 objects, I think. Okay. So experience represents all these relations, but I'm claiming that it's not always apparent to us that it does. And actually the reason that it's not always apparent is precisely the existence of first-person redundancy. Because of the fact that ordinarily to judge that an n-place predicate applies requires n pieces of information, where there is first-person redundancy and we're able to make a judgment based on just one bit of information, that can very easily fool us into thinking that this is a one-place relation or that we're applying a one-place predicate. Notice how easy it is to use things like near and to the left as one-place predicates. You just judge that something is nearby. Of course, that's true if and only if it's near to you. So it's a 2-place relation, but it feels natural to use these one-place predicates in talking about them. And it feels natural because of the fact that we only need one piece of information in judging that they apply, that something is nearby, that it's to the left, and so on. So I want to suggest that, to take the extreme case, color experience, even though I do want to suggest that color phenomenology represents a certain kind of subject-environment relation, it doesn't seem as though it does. It seems as though when you experience color that you're experiencing just a property of something. But I think that it seems that way to you because of the existence of first-person redundancy, because you only need that one bit of information to judge the holding of what is in fact a 2-place relation, according to me. So the fact that the phenomenology doesn't strike you as relational is easily explained by the existence of first-person redundancy. Okay, so over onto the second page of the handout now. So now I need to talk just a little bit about phenomenal concepts, because it's easiest to understand these issues about the epistemic gap between the physical and the phenomenological by thinking in terms of phenomenal concepts. Some people don't believe there are such things as phenomenal concepts, particularly Derek doesn't. He has an article arguing against the existence of phenomenal concepts. I kind of agree. I don't think that there is actually any concept that is intrinsically a phenomenal concept. What I think really is that being phenomenal is a property that concepts can have in certain contexts for certain people. But that's because of a view that I hold about the individuation of concepts. And I'm going to just ignore all that for the moment because that's going to introduce some unnecessary complications. So I'm going to talk as though there are some concepts that really are just phenomenal concepts. If none of that meant anything to you, don't worry about it. That was just an aside. So a phenomenal concept is a concept that we use when thinking about the phenomenal characters of our experiences. And the thing that makes them phenomenal concepts is that they are applied on phenomenological grounds. So think of your concept of phenomenological red. That is the concept of that particular kind of experience you have when you look at a red thing. A concept that you would apply only by having an experience of a red thing. You have that kind of experience and you can judge, yep, I am having a phenomenologically red experience. So call that a phenomenal concept. And I'm just going to assume what I just suggested. I don't really think, but it won't do any harm. I'm just going to assume that there are some concepts that are just inherently like that their application conditions are that they are applied by the experiencing subject on the basis of the experience. So I'll talk about physical concepts when I mean just ordinary concepts that anybody can apply to things going on in the physical world. So firings of C fibers in the brain, all the concepts you need to think about that are physical concepts, for example. So then the issue that's brought out by the knowledge argument and the conceivability argument is that there are no a priori entailments between physical and phenomenal concepts. That is to say, no matter how much knowledge you have about what's going on in a person, where you have that knowledge using physical concepts, no amount of that kind of knowledge will tell you which phenomenal concept applies, if any. So you're having an experience as of something red, you know all about the physical goings on in your brain, or somebody else is having that experience and you know all about the physical goings on in your brain. You've got a complete specification of what's going on physically expressed in terms of physical concepts. That doesn't tell you in itself, through a priori reasoning, whether or not the corresponding phenomenal concept would apply. That's what things like the knowledge argument and all the stuff about the conceivability of zombies is supposed to bring out. The thought that no amount of a priori reasoning about physical states of affairs can tell you anything about what's going on there phenomenologically. There have been attempts by some philosophers like Daniel Dennett to deny that there is any such epistemic gap, but I think there is an epistemic gap of that kind, and I'm just going to take that for granted. So, now, just a reminder about something that intentionalism is already committed to, the kind of strong reductive intentionalism that I'm assuming. And that is that there are no intrinsic qualia. So according to that view, when you apply a phenomenal concept, one thing that definitely does not happen is you do not introspect your conscious experience, attend to an intrinsic red quale, say, and then apply the concept phenomenological red to the occurrence of that red quale. It doesn't go like that, according to intentionalism. Because according to intentionalism, experience is transparent. You cannot introspect these intrinsic qualia, there aren't any. All you can do when you try to attend to your experience is you attend to the world as you perceive it, or at least the world as your experience presents it to you. So in that case, if this kind of view is correct, and I'm assuming more or less without argument that it is, then when you try to judge that you are having an experience as of something red, that is to say, when you try to judge that you are having a phenomenological red experience, well, since what you are actually going to be attending to is the redness of some object that you are perceiving in the world, then it seems that there's a very intimate connection between the conditions under which you could judge that the phenomenal concept applies and the conditions under which you could be warranted in judging that a certain state of affairs obtains that you are perceiving. So I put that on the handout by saying, because of the transparency of experience, one is in a position to correctly apply a phenomenal concept to an experience with phenomenal character P and phenomenal content C, only if one is in a position to judge on the basis of that phenomenal character P that C is the case, at least barring independent defeaters, assuming that you're not hallucinating and so on. Of course, you could be mistaken about whether C is the case because you could be hallucinating or subject to an illusion. Setting all that aside, the thought is this. I'll do it with an example again. Suppose we just set aside the complications of subject-environment relations just for a moment and assume that an experience as of something phenomenologically red just represents it as being red. Well, then the claim would be you are in a position to judge that you are having an experience of phenomenological redness only if your experience warrants you in judging that there is a red thing there. I think that's actually intuitively quite plausible. I find it very difficult to think of a case in which that wouldn't seem to be a plausible statement. I'm not even certain that you need the transparency of experience to make that claim, but I think given that I'm already assuming a transparency of experience, given that I'm a reductive intentionalist, it makes it a lot clearer. So that's a crucial move. So that places an interesting constraint on the circumstances under which you're able epistemologically to apply a phenomenal concept. Go back now to assuming that I'm right about the phenomenal contents of conscious experiences, that they all represent subject-environment relations. Now consider a phenomenal concept, which we'll call E, and that phenomenal concept is the concept of an experience that has phenomenal content that S stands in relation R to X. So that's on the handout as well. So in that case, given what I've just said, it follows that this person S is in a position to apply the phenomenal concept E only if S is in a position to judge that S stands in R to X first person redundantly. And as a shorthand for that, I'm going to say that E, the phenomenal concept, is itself applied first person redundantly. Just to say it again, because this is really crucial, the thought is, given that your phenomenology represents you as standing in a certain relation to something, and given that it does so in a way that would warrant you in making a first person redundant judgment that that relation obtains, then you are able to judge by applying a phenomenal concept that you are having that type of experience only if you would be warranted in making the first person redundant judgment that you stood in that relation to your environment. Just going to pause for a moment to let that sink in. So, given that only the subject S is in a position to judge that that relation obtains first person redundantly, because only S is one of the relata in the relation, and so only S can make use of that epistemic advantage, it follows immediately that there's a particular reason why S is the only person who can ever apply that phenomenal concept. Now, moving on to section 1.4 in the handout there. All of this, I shall now explain, shows why phenomenal concepts are inferentially isolated from physical ones. So suppose once again we have a phenomenal concept E, and we have a corresponding physical concept P subscript E, or P sub E. And when I say a corresponding physical concept, what I mean is, if materialism is true, then the physical concept P sub E stands for a certain physical state of affairs, which is exactly the state of affairs of a certain brain being in a certain state, which has a certain phenomenal character, and that's also the very same state to which the phenomenal concept E applies. So both of these concepts apply to the same physical state of affairs if a materialist theory is true. Clearly those are different concepts because the epistemic conditions under which E is applied are quite different from the epistemic conditions under which P sub E is applied. And two concepts are different if the epistemic conditions under which they apply differ, because it means there can be circumstances in which you're warranted in applying one of them, but not the other one. So far all we've got is that we've got two distinct concepts with different conditions of warranted application. Now, normally, when you have different concepts and different conditions of warranted application, there's an epistemic gap between them. If you don't know that Hesperus is phosphorus and you know that Hesperus is bright, it doesn't enable you to infer through a priori reasoning that phosphorus is bright. But in the normal case, where there's that kind of epistemic gap, the gap can be closed by the acquisition of further information, further third-person physical information. So standard example that gets used to illustrate this is the concept water and the concept H2O. So water just is H2O, so these are concepts for the same thing. But let's assume that the concept water is applied, you judge that something is water just when you see a clear liquid that's drinkable, watery stuff, in other words. Whereas H2O is a scientific concept that's applied on the basis of certain kinds of scientific tests that you might carry out to discover that something is H2O. So it would be possible to know that something is water without knowing that it's H2O and vice versa until you've discovered that water is H2O. But although there's an epistemic gap initially between those different concepts because of their different conditions of application, you can close it by acquiring further information. You do the physics, you learn about how H2O molecules behave, you learn how they interact with one another in large masses at certain temperatures. You realize that all of that lot together forms a fluid, that it's transparent, light would pass through it, and so on and so forth. And then you conclude that, in fact, all the conditions for being watery stuff are met when you have a certain mass of H2O molecules at a certain temperature. And so you're able to judge that because there's a certain collection of H2O molecules in a certain place, there's a certain mass of water in that place. And so the epistemic gap between knowledge about H2O and knowledge about water can be closed by the addition of more third-person scientific information. That's the case for any normal third-person concepts. But it doesn't apply when one of the concepts is a phenomenal concept of the kind that I've described. It doesn't apply because of the first-person redundancy in the application conditions for the phenomenal concept. That's because if all you have is P sub E, you have the physical concept. That might be shorthand for a whole set of sentences about a certain physical state of affairs. But given that only S can be in the position to apply that phenomenal concept, because only S is in a position to make the judgment regarding the content of the corresponding experience first person redundantly. it follows that there cannot be an a priori inferential route from P sub E to E. Because if you're not S, then no amount of additional information can put you in a position epistemically that only S can occupy. If you're not S, you can never be in a position to judge RSX first person redundantly. And if you can't be in a position to judge RSX first person redundantly, then you can't be in a position to apply the phenomenal concept. So it follows that there is no way that you can get the fact that E applies by a priori reasoning from the fact that P sub E applies, no matter which concept or set of physical concepts P sub E might be. You simply can't, through any kind of inference, take yourself from the third person perspective to the first person perspective. And even if you are S, you still can't make that inference, because inferences don't depend on who you are. If someone else can't infer E from P sub E, then simply being S can't put you in a position to infer something that nobody else could infer from P sub E. So even S, the subject, even if S knows a complete specification of S's physical state, it wouldn't put S in a position to infer what kind of phenomenology there would be, because it wouldn't put S in a position to apply the relevant phenomenal concept, just on the basis of a priori reasoning from the physical specification. So, complicated route to get us here, but if all that's correct, then it follows that there's no a priori entailment from physical to phenomenal concepts, and yet that's perfectly compatible with materialism. It's just a consequence of the difference between the first person perspective and the third person perspective. And in fact, it turns out to be a very, very similar kind of inferential isolation to what I think you get with egocentric concepts, the ones that are associated with the so-called essential indexical, that something is happening soon, or that it's to the left, or that it's nearby. One can't infer any of those things from a completely third-person description of the world at a certain time. And I think the reason is exactly the same. It has to do with first-person redundancy and the first-person perspective. You get an explanation of why there can be a certain set of concepts that are inferentially isolated from the other kinds of concepts because of the first-person perspective. Okay, that's the end of part one of the talk. What should I do here? I can either move on to part two and start talking about why I think that experiences do represent these subject-environment relations, and I can say more about what kinds of subject-environment relations they are, or I can just stop and you can ask questions. What would you like to do? I shall continue if people don't indicate that they would like to ask questions.
I have a question, but if you want to continue, that's fine.
I'd be happy to stop and deal with that question now. Maybe it would just give everybody a break anyway, rather than listening to me.
Okay, so partially I'm just trying to understand this, but so it seems to me like there will be cases of redundancy that aren't first-person redundancy. So here's an example. Judging that something is 10 pounds, something weighs 10 pounds. So having a certain weight is a kind of relation. Things have different weight on the moon or whatever than they have on Earth. But I don't need to know about the mass of the Earth or anything like that to make this judgment about the weight of an object. I just put it on my scale and I look at where the needle points and I make the judgment about the object as though it were a kind of one place non-relational judgment. Okay, so
I'm a little confused already because so the weight of an object is the downward force, or the force required to hold it up. Is that how you're thinking of weight, or are you actually talking about mass?
No, I'm talking about weight. Yeah. I'm thinking, well, I mean, there are complications about this, I guess, but the mass is more or less an intrinsic feature of a thing. But, you know, people say things like, when the astronauts went to the moon, they weighed less. So I'm thinking that the weight is a kind of relational feature.
Okay, so what you weigh on one planet is different from what you weigh on the other planet, and so that's the reason for thinking it's a relation.
Yeah, right. If you don't like this example, maybe there are other kinds of examples, but...
Well, that's okay. Carry on and let's see where you're going with it.
Okay, so suppose that's right, that that when I make a judgment about what something weighs, that is kind of implicitly relational. So it doesn't seem like, so I'm wondering whether you think that if that's right, there could be an analogous kind of explanatory gap-like phenomenon about weight. So I'm thinking if there were a concept that is only, its application conditions are such that you're only allowed to apply it when you're like looking at a scale and, you know, seeing where the needle points. In that case, no one who wasn't looking at a scale would be in a position to apply that concept. And so no matter what information you had about the masses of different objects and, you know, background physics, you wouldn't be able to bridge this gap between, you know, weight conceived of in this via this kind of special concept and these other physical facts that you know.
So it seems like you could find out about the weight of the object by being given further information. Like you're given a physical specification of the scales, and you're also told what the needle is pointing at. And it seems that all of that is sufficient to tell you what the weight of the object would be. So there's clearly there doesn't seem to be anything that's inferentially isolated there.
Yeah, I agree, but I'm just wondering why not. It seems like, I mean, maybe you think for some reason there just couldn't be a concept with that kind of application conditions, like a concept that you can only apply when you are looking at a scale. And maybe that's right, although
I'm finding the example.
Yeah.
The example's complicated because you're bringing in the observer looking at the scale.
Yeah.
But actually the thing that seems to be doing the work in the example is the fact that the scale the needle points at one thing, and that tells you about a relation between whatever's sitting on the scale and what the planet. Mm-hmm. So this object stands in the 10 newtons relation to this planet. Mm-hmm. But if we took the scale to another planet, it wouldn't stand in the 10 newtons relation to that planet. Mm-hmm. So what is the state of affairs that we're thinking that the needle is telling us about? And it seems like if you don't know which planet you're on, then the only information that the needle can give you is that the object on the scale stands in the 10 Newton relation to some planet. But then if you want to know which planet, you're going to have to get an extra piece of information. You know, which planet are we actually on? Mm-hmm. So I'm having a little bit of difficulty understanding how exactly the analogy goes.
Right. Yeah, I guess I'm not really sure how to answer that question. Maybe I just haven't completely wrapped my head around first-person redundancy. I was just thinking, I guess, before so people people thought about weight before they understood sort of what kind of phenomenon weight was.
Right, so it took some discoveries to distinguish weight from mass, for example.
For example,
mass being
right.
a property that something can have that doesn't vary when you take it to another planet, but weight is something that will vary because of the force. So maybe it'll help to say this. The phenomenon of first-person redundancy is a kind of it's the epistemic cousin of what John Perry was on about when he talked about unarticulated constituents.
Mm-hmm.
He has all these examples of the people that live in a place called Zealand, and they make the judgment that it is raining. And that's true if and only if it's raining here and now. But the Zealanders never go anywhere, and so they have no concept of a place. So when they judge that it's raining, in a certain sense, there's some redundancy there because they don't have to pay attention to which place it is. But it's the place where they are. So actually, it is a relation between themselves and their environment and the rain that's doing the work there. So I think something similar is probably going on with weight, that when people thought that weight was a measurement of something objective, they didn't realize that implicitly that thing weighs a certain amount where we are. So where there is a sort of redundancy there, it may well actually be first-person redundancy, because it may be that the judgment implicitly smuggles in the fact that it's where we are that determines what it is.
And where there is that, and because there's this first personal element, you would say that there's a kind of explanatory gap.
Yeah, you can never go from that third person information to the bit that has that redundancy in it.
Okay.
I think it's a feature of all Perry's cases and all cases you might think of like that it always seems to be the context of the speaker that's determining what it is that's unarticulated and is filling in the gap, or determine what it is that should go into the unarticulated bits of the content. So that's a sort of semantic equivalent of the epistemic phenomenon that I'm talking about. And it's very closely related because Perry thinks that, that the content of experience contains sort of monadicity, that things seem to be to the left or nearby, and that the subject is in effect an unarticulated constituent in the content there. And the thing that I'm talking about and calling first-person redundancy is just the sort of epistemic equivalent of that.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Gareth, you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you. I don't know if this is useful, so it's maybe just me, but I wondered if what this was making me think of was the example of like spherical triangles, like a triangle drawn on a globe. Whereas if you have, with the bottoms on the equator, but you can draw one on the other side, those triangles would be entirely the same in their definition, and the only difference in how they are must rely on our position in relation to them. And it might be nothing, but I was thinking, does that mean that in that case we then have to be aware of our position is in some way constitutive of the phenomenology?
Well, I think there is an analogy there because, when Euclid said the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, he thought he was saying something that's just objectively true and not a relation to himself. Mm. But you could say that implicitly, his own presence there was fixing the context as being in a region of more or less flat space-time where the angles of a triangle do add up to 180 degrees. So you can sort of interpret what he said as being true, given that it was actually relative to the kind of space that we occupy. It puts me in mind of another of John Perry's examples, which is that in relativity theory, we know that whether or not two events are simultaneous depends on the frame of reference. So we used to think that simultaneity was simply a two-place predicate, But in fact, it seems to be a three-place predicate implicitly between two events and a frame of reference. But in practice, when we make judgments about what's simultaneous with what, we're kind of implicitly taking our own rest frame, the frame of reference in which we're not moving, as determining the frame of reference in which it's relevant to determine whether two events are simultaneous. So I think that there are lots and lots of these examples where the person making the judgment implicitly adds in an extra bit of the context. And in a lot of those cases, they do so without realizing their own role in it. And so there's a kind of first-person redundancy in it. Okay, I think we've got some other questions. So Amr, I think is next.
Yeah, so because just have only 20 minutes left, I think. I don't know whether we should proceed or should I just get the question?
Just go ahead.
Okay, so can I understand that your position has to do with, let us say, like denying the notion of the a priori entailment from the first person position?
I certainly agree that there is no a priori entailment between third person physical knowledge and our, call it first person, or if you like, knowledge of our conscious states. And so the application of the phenomenal concepts that we might use.
Yeah. May I ask why this requirement is in place, in the first place? Like, from where this idea is why it's mainstream in the literature that there should be a priori entailment?
Because, well, it's illustrated by things like the knowledge argument. If there were an a priori entailment from physical concepts to phenomenal concepts, then Mary in her black and white room, because she has all of the physical knowledge and she's fantastic at thinking, she's got unlimited capacities to reason, it seems that then she should be able to infer what phenomenal concepts would apply to the experience of somebody whose brain was in a certain configuration, say the configuration of experiencing something red. And so in that case, it seems like it shouldn't be any surprise to her what kind of experience she has when she first sees red, if she knows what brain state she's going to be in when that happens. And it's the same sort of intuition that's driving the zombie argument. The thought is, no matter how much you think about somebody's physical configuration, you think about what neurons are firing and how they're all connected up and so on, it seems that that kind of information can't tell you, just through a priori reasoning from that, what the phenomenology would be. So
the redundancy thesis then here just says that because simply I can't have this experience unless I am in the position of Mary. It's kind of trying to say.
Not really. It's about being able to apply the phenomenal concept. So knowing what the phenomenology is like, I assume, is intimately tied up with possessing and being able to use a certain kind of concept. If you know what the phenomenology is like, that means you can think about that phenomenology. And if you're thinking about the phenomenology, then you must be using a phenomenal concept in doing so. So even if you never have a certain experience, I mean, there's some distracting side issues here about whether you could come to possess a phenomenal concept without ever having had the experience. I think that my sort of story actually provides a nice story about why you wouldn't be able to, perhaps. But you could set up cases in which, you know, somebody is given a red experience and then given a blue experience, and so they have the phenomenal concepts. But then the point is that if you then give them two brain configurations, they can't match up the physical with the phenomenological.
Okay, thank you.
Xintong has a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So I was also just wondering, I was trying to understand the idea of first-person redundancy. So I was wondering, so the idea is that, if I understood it correctly, is that normally with in-place relations, we'll make a judgment about that. My judgment would be based on n parameters. But in the case of first-person redundant judgment, then I can make that judgment just on the basis of making judgment about one parameter.
One less than n, anyway.
Right, yeah. So I was thinking about case of making judgment about someone A is taller than B. So one way of making that judgment, of course, can be that knowing what the height of A is and what the height of B is, and then make a comparison. But it seems to me I can also make that judgment just by looking at both of them. So I guess in another sense, I was wondering what that parameter is. So it seems that I can make that judgment just perceptually and non-inferentially. And if the appearance of A and B count as just one parameter, and it seems that I can make a judgment just on the basis of that, then does it make that first person redundant?
It had better not.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I wish I had a fully worked out story about what counts as a parameter. At the moment, I have to leave it intuitively, but in the case you describe, what I would say is, if you see two people and they look like that,
yeah,
well, there are two separate bits of phenomenology there. There's this one and there's this one. And so I think for that reason, we should think of that as two parameters.
Right, but it seems that the way I can make that judgment is that I take both of them into my head simultaneously, rather than just paying attention to the left bit, the person A first, and then paying attention to person B next. Because in that way, I wouldn't be able to make this kind of judgment just by the look of them. I have to look at both of them simultaneously. Or maybe another example will illustrate this point better. So think about that I can make a judgment that A is of different color of B just by looking both of them simultaneously. Like if both of them are in my visual field, I don't need to know what color A, what is the color of A or what is color of B. I just need to look both of them at the same time. So I don't know whether it would be plausible to say that the color of A is one parameter and color of B is another parameter, because it seems that my judgment does not rely on that at all.
Well, it does seem as though in the situation you describe, you're in a position where you could make a judgment about the color of each thing individually.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps you have to be. It would be interesting to see if there is a case where you can judge that two things are different colors without being able to judge the color of either of them individually. There might be such a case. There's some weird stuff happens when you start to look into perceptual psychology.
Yeah.
But on the face of it, it doesn't look as though that's something that can easily happen. So I think that's why that's a case where there are two parameters.
Right.
It seems like you have to be in a position to judge each of them individually, which you would be.
Okay. Thanks. I'll think about that more. Thanks.
Any other questions? If not, then what I'll do is I'll give a super quick indication of what's going on in the second half. All right. So let's just think about this. Okay, so I'm suggesting that the phenomenal character of any conscious experience represents some relation between subject and environment, but why do I think that, and what kind of relation is it? So the easiest cases to see this for are going to be spatiotemporal cases. Let's do the spatial case first. That's probably the easiest one. Perhaps I'll just talk about that. So I've already talked about some respects in which in spatial perception we are aware of relations between ourselves and our environment. But I think there's a less obvious way in which spatial experience represents subject-environment relations, and that is to do with perceived scale or perceived size. So I'm going to throw caution to the wind here and just describe a fantastical thought experiment. There's a million things to say about why this isn't problematic, but I've got lots to say if you have objections. But just suppose that there is another planet just like this one with perfect duplicates of everyone and everything, but it's half as big. So call it small Earth. Or maybe I've done it the other way around. Big Earth, it's twice as big. So there is a perfect duplicate of you, twice as big, sitting in a perfect duplicate of the room that you are in right now, which is twice as big, and everything is twice as big. Now, how do things look to your big Earth doppelganger? I would want to argue that things look just the same. The local environment there looks just the same to your doppelganger as your environment does to you. I've got a long, long paper arguing for this at great length, but I think it's prima facie plausible that that would be the case. If that's true, then when you look at your computer, it looks a certain size in front of you. And when your doppelganger looks at your doppelganger's computer, it looks phenomenologically the same size to your doppelganger. But of course, the actual size is different. So that's the reason straight away for doubting that size phenomenology actually represents size. And the natural thing to think that it actually represents is something relative to the subject. And I think, in fact, the correct story about this case is that perceived sizes of things are the sizes of things relative to the size of the subject's body. But of course, in order to judge how big something is, you don't have to compare it with the size of your body. It just looks a certain size phenomenologically. And so that's where first-person redundancy gets into this. Now, the interesting thing about the size of something relative to your body is it determines all the possibilities for causal interactions of a certain kind. How big a door is relative to your body determines whether you can fit through that door. How near something is relative to your size determines whether or not it's something you can reach out and touch, or whether it's out of reach. Think about what your doppelganger on Big Earth means by talking about 1 meter. Assume that they produce just the corresponding words to us. But of course, their word 1 meter, that refers to what we would call 2 meters. But what they call 1 meter has exactly the same role in their lives that what we call 1 meter has in our lives. Now consider the equivalent issue for time. Consider slow Earth, where everything is exactly the same, but it's slowed down to half the rate. But it's set up in such a way that everything, there's exactly the corresponding series of events unfolds over time, just at half the rate, due to some weird quirk of the local physics. Again, I can give you a lengthy defense of this as a possibility, but just to illustrate the point quickly, bear with me. So again, how do things seem to your slow Earth doppelganger? I would say that when a car goes past in the road at half the speed on slow Earth as the corresponding car goes on Earth, that the way it appears to your slow Earth doppelganger, whose brain processes are at half the speed, is phenomenologically just the same as your car looks to you. So, exactly corresponding line of argument, it follows that when we perceive rates and correspondingly when we perceive durations, intervals of time, it's not actually the rates or the durations that our phenomenology represents. Instead, I think the natural thing to think is, again, it's something relative to us. Now, there isn't a very straightforward equivalent of body size that we could use to relativize the rates or durations of perceived events too. But remember the story about the role of what's called 1 meter in the lives of the earthlings and the big earthlings. So the slow earthlings use the phrase 1 second to refer to what we would call 2 seconds of time. But what the slow earthlings call 1 second has just the same role in their lives that what we call 1 second has in our lives. And correspondingly for minutes and hours and so on. What we think when we say 2 hours is quite long enough to listen to Simon go on about consciousness, the doppelganger on slow earth is saying just the same thing. What they call 2 hours is definitely long enough to hear Simon droning on about consciousness. So it seems then, based at least on just the spatial and temporal examples, that what our experiences are representing is the world relativized to us in just the right way as to capture the significance of our environment for our interaction with that environment, the role of things that we perceive in the environment in our lives. And so I call these kinds of relations subject-environment functional relations, because in all these cases, what we're really doing is these big Earth, little Earth cases, slow Earth, normal Earth cases, these are all cases in which we're showing that the phenomenology is multiply realizable in terms of represented properties like size or duration. And where you have multiple realizability, a very natural hypothesis is that what's really going on is that what you're dealing with is some kind of functional relation, something functional. So my claim is that what the phenomenology is doing is it's representing something functional. It's representing the properties of the environment in relation to us in terms of the causal significance of our environment for our abilities to interact with it. Same thing applies in a fairly straightforward way to the heavy example. When something feels heavy to a certain extent, it's just difficult for me to lift to a certain extent. Same thing for my heavy earth doppelganger, or just for another person who is stronger or weaker than me. You don't need to go to fantastical sci-fi examples actually to find cases where people are bigger or smaller or things go on in different rates and so on. And I think that although it'll be a whole lot less obvious, I think that the same thing plausibly applies to other bits of phenomenology, such as taste phenomenology, color phenomenology, and so on. With taste phenomenology, it's certainly quite plausible that different tastes have some sort of role for us. Things that are nutritious for us taste good in certain ways. Being nutritious for us, that's a certain relation we stand in. Something that is nutritious for us might be quite poisonous to a different creature, a creature with a different physiology. And as a matter of fact, it's no coincidence that most natural poisons do taste bitter to us. So the hypothesis then is that that sweet taste is telling you something about that substance being nutritious in a sort of energy-giving way for me. And that bitter taste is telling me that this stuff is poisonous for a creature like me in a certain way. Now for color experience, it's going to be a whole lot less obvious exactly what's going on. I have enough to say about color experience to give a completely different talk on it. There's a great deal to be said. What I do want to say is that colors, I mean, the color case is fantastically complicated because colors have a very complicated role in our lives, and color perception is multifunctional. It does all kinds of different things. But there is some evidence empirically that different color experiences produce systematically different behavior, at least for some kinds of creatures. There are some kinds of relatively simple creatures, for example, where there's a nice experiment somebody did with zebrafish, where they put them in a fish tank that's got a sort of cross shape to it. And they shone different colored lights in the 4 arms of this cross. There's blue, yellow, red, green. And all the zebrafish congregate in one of these arms, always, very systematically. There's a certain color they prefer to be around, and certain other colors that they really want to be away from. So, okay, I can't explain the full story here, but I want to suggest that there is a certain sort of information there intrinsically in certain kinds of color experiences, in addition to all the other stuff that color experiences tell us about boundaries between different materials and certain kinds of contrasts and a whole lot of other stuff. Now, one thing I have encountered when I've talked to some people about these ideas is straight away they go to the color experience case and they say, yeah, that's going to be a difficult case to explain what sort of relation is being represented by an experience as of something being read. At least, whereas with some of these other cases, you might think it's introspectively kind of plausible that a certain kind of relation is there. With color, people think otherwise. So I just want to finish with a methodological point about not giving up too easily and about not starting on hard cases. I think it's methodologically a big mistake with something like this to start from the hard case and try to develop a theory just to deal with the hard case. Color experiences are the hard case because it's very difficult, based on any kind of introspection, to assess what color experiences are doing in us. I think this was a problem for functionalism. It's easy enough to see what spatial and temporal experiences are doing in terms of what functional role they might have. But when you introspect color experiences, it's far less apparent how a blue experience differs in its functional role from a red experience. And that's why people have thought that the inverted spectrum makes sense for color experience and so on. Shift the example to taste experience or various other kinds of experiences, it starts to look a whole lot less plausible. If you were to think about how you do things in science, it would be really perverse to start with the difficult case and build your theory from there and give up on it if it doesn't immediately work. Think about gravitational astronomy. You want to develop a theory of gravity that explains why astronomical objects move in relation to each other in the way that they do. How do you go about that? Well, you start with the easy case. You start with 2 objects. You work out what the gravitational force is, and then that explains why 2 objects orbit around each other in a certain nice straightforward way. What you definitely don't do is start with 13 objects and try to figure out a theory of gravity that would explain the way they all move around with each other. And if you can't immediately make it work, give up and abandon that theory. I fear that that's what some philosophers do when they start off thinking about whether or not they can make it work for color experience. My approach is the opposite. Start with the easy cases, which are probably going to be spatial and temporal experience. Then work your way towards the slightly more difficult cases, which might include things like gustatory experience. And then, based on all that, see if you can tell a story for color experience based on similar sorts of principles. As I said, I have a story to tell about that, but I haven't got the time to go into the details. But I invite you not to give up on this kind of theory just because there's a prima facie question, how exactly is this going to work for color experience? Okay, I think we probably are getting short of time. I don't know whether people want to stop or whether people have questions. I'll stop talking. I see some applause. Thank you very much. Are there any questions anybody wants to ask? Other than what the hell was all that about? Okay, well, if you, for some weird reason, do want to know more about this, the paper was circulated, so you can read some more of what I say about some of these cases, but you'll have to wait a few years for the book to really explain it all properly. Unless, as I said, somebody can point out a real problem in the reasoning in the meantime.
I do have a question, but I'm conscious of time. I don't know if, do you want to hear it?
I'm happy to hear it. I don't need to be anywhere, but yeah, if
Okay.
people need to leave, they should feel that it is polite to leave if they want to.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe, John, if you need to go, maybe you can end the recording, or just go when you need to go. So I guess an old idea about phenomenal concepts is that they're the kind of concept that has these special application conditions that you only are allowed to apply in experience, like to an experience as you're having it, or something like that. So you have that's part of your view of the explanatory gap, but then there's also this first person redundancy part. And I wasn't quite sure what part was doing what work. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I can answer. So I don't think that the usual phenomenal concept strategies work because, as I said when I was talking about the water and H2O example, ordinarily, where you have different concepts, you can get from one to the other if you've got enough information about the world. So in order for a story about phenomenal concepts to work, it has to explain why phenomenal concepts should be inferentially isolated from physical concepts. And I don't think any of the stories that are out there at the moment do that convincingly. The first person redundancy stuff explains why there would be that inferential isolation. So that's doing the work of giving an account of phenomenal concepts such that phenomenal concepts would be inferentially isolated from physical concepts.
So it's not, So it's not just, so you do need both of these components though, right? It's not just first person redundancy, but also the idea of a concept that is only correctly applied under certain circumstances.
Well, when I first thought about this, I wasn't thinking about it entirely in terms of concepts. I sort of came to the conclusion that it's better to put it in terms of concepts. But it depends on things like what you think is involved in knowing what a certain kind of experience is like, for example. I'm assuming that that involves having a certain kind of concept that you can deploy. But if you think that it involves, for example, being able to carry out a certain kind of offline simulation of that experience, then I think that the story about first person redundancy could give you a story about why it is that no amount of physical knowledge could put you in a position to carry out that kind of offline simulation of a conscious experience. But I think that really it's natural to think that what you're doing when you carry out that offline simulation is you're just thinking about the experience using the concept, using the phenomenal concept. But I mean, what exactly I say would have to depend on exactly what the objection is to phenomenal concepts. If it's anything like your objection that has to do with concept sharing, well then, as I said, I do actually kind of agree, but I just think that although you could share my phenomenal concept, it wouldn't be phenomenal for you in that sense. I think that different people can share a concept, but one of them applies it in one way and another one can apply it in another way. And what it takes for them to be shared is not that they share the same conditions of warranted application. But that's a whole other story.
I guess what I'm wondering about is it just seems like, so consider the fact RSX Um,